孙乔伊，我是这个活动的主持人，欢迎大家来参加我们 GCC 的2021年的线上大会。这个会议的题目是电视里的中国。Hi everyone, my name is Joey Arnold, and welcome to the 2021 GCC Global Summit. Where our topic we have a series of panel, and this topic for this panel will be China representation in movie and animation. And basically, if you don't know what GCC is, let's go into I'll give you guys a quick overview. GCC is an organization where we focus on, my apologies, I forgot to share my screen. Here we go. So you guys can actually see the same thing I'm seeing. GCC is especially focused on connecting Chinese and non-Chinese students, alumni, and professionals to build meaningful relationships. And in Chinese, we have a saying in GCC is 连接轴承未来, which is basically focusing on that connection aspect. That's pretty much what GCC is. Our goal is to be the most respected, sought after, and far-reaching link between future leaders from China and the rest of the world. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and introduce our panelists. Right here. First, we have Mr. Curtis Chin. He was the fourth ambassador for ASD, Asian Development Bank, and he was a previous ambassador for Asian Development Bank. He was the fourth ambassador of Chinese heritage there, and he is also a part of the Milken Institute, which is a think tank based in Singapore and Thailand. And then we have Mr. Lindsay Connor, and he is leader of Manette Phillips Entertainment, and he's a leader in he's basically focused on the business aspect between China and the US. He's a very important figure in the global industry, and he has been listed as in Variety 500, which is a list of 500 influential people in the global media industry. And he is also, I think, in the Hollywood's top 20. I think one of the most, I think it's I have to check this, I'm sorry. You're listed as top 20 deal makers of the year by the Hollywood Reporter as well. So without further ado, I'm going to let you two go ahead and introduce yourself for about 5 minutes each.
Curtis, do you want to start?
Yeah, Joe, you've hit most of the highlights. I would just like, the Milken Institute, we're actually the headquarters. While I'm based normally in Asia, I'm right now in the US during the pandemic. But our headquarters is actually in Los Angeles. And I think, what this think tank does, really like your group, it tries to convene people. But for us, it's not just China and the US, but it's convening people from different sectors, private, public, not-for-profit, as well as various countries around the world. So while I am normally based in Singapore and Thailand, as you noted, Joey, our global headquarters is out of LA, out of Santa Monica. The other thing I would just flag is that, I'm always learning from Lindsay too. I'm looking forward to this session also. Certainly for the business side, for me, I speak more to issues regarding representation, certainly China and the US and the China, way back when, probably before many of you were even born. I ran a company called Burson Marsteller, big PR firms, operations out of Beijing, just as China was opening up in the 90s, and then moved down to take over our Hong Kong headquarters operation. So a mix of back and forth between Asia and the US. But Joey, I think you've covered everything.
Well, I'll be happy to jump in. First of all, my thanks to the Global China Connection for inviting me to be with you tonight, and I'm happy to do so. I am, as Joey noted, the leader of the entertainment group at Manette Phelps and Phillips, which is a large national law firm. We have very much a global practice. My focus is film, television, and digital, both in terms of mergers and acquisitions, company finance, and the financing, production, and distribution of films and television and other digital content. The practice is very much global, but I think the reason I'm here tonight is because I've been one of the pioneers in what I call the China-Hollywood partnership. Perhaps we should call it the China-Hollywood relationship, which really didn't get started much until about 2007, 2008, when China's State Council announced that over the next 7 to 8 years, they wanted to see entertainment and leisure industries rise from about 2.5% of China's GDP to 10% of China's GDP. And it became clear to everyone on both sides of the Pacific who's in the industry that that meant the Chinese government was going to put its chips on the table and get people in China to dive into the entertainment industry and welcome participation going both ways. It took a while for the two business cultures to kind of get to know each other and get to trust each other. And then along about 7 years ago, 6-7 years ago, things started to move. And I had the privilege of doing the first successful Chinese investment in a Hollywood film slate. I represented Huayi Brothers of Beijing in an 18-film deal with the studio called STX Entertainment. That led to my being hired by Perfect World of Beijing, Perfect World Pictures of Beijing. And we did a $500 million 50-film 5-year deal with Universal, which remains to this day the largest ever Chinese investment in a Hollywood film slate. Lots of other activity going on, and most of my cross-Pacific activity has been in representing Chinese companies doing business in the United States and in particular in Hollywood. It's been a very interesting ride, and I think I'll stop there and we'll look forward to speaking more about it over the course of the next hour.
Sure. And just to get started, we know we discussed this the other day. We can start off with a pretty easy question. So how is China's influence on the global film industry? Like, how has that changed over the past few years, and what factors do you all feel like are driving this change?
Well, China's film industry has expanded enormously. Look, China's had a domestic film industry for decades, but 20 years ago there were about 4,000 cinemas, 4,000 screens in China. Today there's 80,000 screens in China. The film industry has just exploded there. And it's been great for the domestic film industry. It's been a boon to China's influence around the world. Now, China's film industry isn't yet producing a lot of pictures that are big successes outside of China or outside of the Chinese diaspora outside of China. But the Chinese film industry is so big domestically that it's allowed a lot of companies to become very healthy and to become very successful. China is now, well, COVID's an odd year, but in 2019, China had the second biggest box office in the world, second only to the United States. In 2020, China had the largest box office in the world because we weren't releasing many new pictures here. But I think it's fair to say that in 2021 and beyond, China will have one of the two largest box office hauls in the world. So the Chinese film industry has really exploded over the last 20 years.
I think that's really interesting that you mentioned the fact that I didn't think about this. The number of theaters built wouldn't necessarily affect that. I didn't think that they didn't really have as many theaters built. I just figured there weren't, like, I guess people weren't as attracted to it, but that does make a lot of sense for that to multiply by number 5, 6, 7, 8 times greater. Like that would result in a much larger box office.
Yeah, and not only there's, you know, they've expanded, if you will, both horizontally and vertically. So this is, I mean, this will be not news at all to Chinese students from China who are watching this program. It may be news to American students. China has what they call tier 1 cities, tier 2 cities, tier 3, and tier 4 cities. And you know, the stunning thing is that in the United States, I believe there's 10 cities with a population greater than 1 million. In China, there's more than 60 cities with population of more than 1 million, and an awful lot of those cities had no cinemas at all 20 years ago. People in those cities, huge bustling cities had nowhere to go to the movies. Now with this huge building program that's gone on, you can go see movies in any city worthy of the name city in China. So it's allowed the Chinese audience as a whole to really come into the box office. And in spanking new theaters, state of the art, China has more 3D screens than the United States does. Newer theaters. And the other thing that's happened is that the Chinese film industry, which leaders in the Chinese film industry will tell you just wasn't on a par with that of the West, and particularly in the United States. And they were anxious to learn from Hollywood filmmakers. The Chinese film industry has come a long, long way in terms of its quality. And now Chinese product is doing incredibly well at the Chinese box office.
Yeah, I would just jump in and see, I always look at these things. Earlier, Joey, when we all talked, I think, Lindsay, I can always learn from the number side. I come from a US government side, as well as just the businessman in Asia and the US side. And it's often interesting when you talk about things like soft power or hard power. How does one define success? And so clearly, sometimes it's just about the money. And so then we can look at global box office. And indeed, this past year has been a weird year where there really weren't US films, to the most part, being released in China. And so even more so, of course, Chinese films dominated the box office. But I also look at it from a soft power point of view. You go anywhere in this world, you will see American films. Bad for Hollywood, sometimes you'll see a lot of American films that no one is really paying for. They're selling you DVDs, and now everything is online. And certainly, from a US perspective, our form of culture is out there. But from a Hollywood studio or a creative perspective, not so great in terms of that intellectual property. And so I think now when people think about, certainly here in the United States, if you think about film, if you think about television, America dominates here, of course, but also around the world, including, I would say, almost like the American form of storytelling and how a story takes place. It's really very different. You go to Europe, and you'll say, oh, that film is so American. And what do you mean? Because sometimes it's not even an American film. It's, it's a happy ending. It was so amazing, and the big stars were in it. China isn't quite there yet, but I think from a box office perspective, certainly they're there. When I think of it, though, from when I'm in Asia, what are people watching when they're not watching American movies? They're watching Korean dramas. In the old days, it was Japanese dramas. Now everyone's like, did you see that latest Korean drama? They aren't quite yet saying, there are of course exceptions. They aren't quite yet saying, have you seen that Chinese drama? Did you listen to that Chinese pop star? So it's not quite there. For American businesses, I always say, and this is for either Chinese students or US students, one thing that's really, for me, very unique about the Chinese market is the way that politics, the uncertainty can intervene, I'd say more so than any other place. I mean, look at this year right now, the flagship event for Hollywood is generally the Oscars, right? End of last year, people in China were actually quite excited about a Chinese director, Chloe Zhao, talked a lot about her. Now she's kind of vanished because people have found some things she said that weren't so complimentary about China. The big story 2 days ago on the BBC, and the BBC is now banned in China, was that how China has begun to blur out the shoes, the clothes of people on TV shows, because they were maybe showing Adidas or Nike. And for me, it would be interesting, are they going to blur that out in the movies too? And so I think in the long run, these are waves that come and go. China will certainly move forward, but because this is a key anniversary year for the Communist Party in China, because there's tremendous uncertainty about how things will unfold with the pandemic, including in China, because of the economic uncertainty, China needs stability. And Hollywood, if in some unintentional way, can be used to hinder that keeping of stability. then things won't be business as usual. It's very different than in most places I operate. I mean, I normally am in Singapore and in Thailand and in Japan, and I would, in the old days, I would say, and in Hong Kong. But even Hong Kong is now swept up into how things are done in China, which it doesn't mean you can't make a lot of money in film, in entertainment in the mainland. But it does mean you have to be more prepared for the uncertainty. Maybe there's even a little bit of self-censorship. You know, that's just how the dynamic plays out, particularly in a time right now when geopolitics intervenes in the world of business.
So do you all think that, I think at one point you mentioned a little bit about the pandemic and its effect on it. Both of y'all mentioned that. Do you all think that this is a temporary boost for China and that other countries would necessarily, they'll just catch up next year? Or do you think this will be a long lasting effect on the entertainment industry? Like this kind of gave, you know, the US had a certain boost in World War II that it kind of just rode on out to this point. And it's just like, it was able to be the economic power since everyone else was helping to help build them up. Do you think this is kind of a similar situation for China now that they have kind of a little headway? Can they kind of keep this? They possibly lose it? Like what will possibly go on?
Well, your crystal ball is probably as good as mine. You know, one facet in the entertainment industry, or one impact of the pandemic, is that US studios were not releasing their top movies because movie theaters in the United States were closed. So, and then they didn't release elsewhere in the world because of piracy concerns. So with the exception of Tenet, which was the one kind of tentpole picture that got released in 2020, you had very little being released by the US studios. The Chinese box office recovered much more quickly. Chinese product was out there, people really liked it, and you know, it's blowing the doors off the cinema. So you know, that has given the Chinese domestic film industry a little bit of an edge riding into 2021. You know, what a difference a few years make. A few years ago, China was so concerned that US films were taking 2/3 of the box office in China that they declared July and August a America film free zone. There were no American films allowed to be screened during July and August of that year. And that kept up for a few years, and it was designed to level the box office. Well, last year, American films did about 15% of the Chinese box office. The Chinese domestic product took the rest. So is that the future? Or, you know, as American studios start to release more of those tent poles the world is waiting for, you know, will that share rise? I don't think anyone knows. I mean, if you forced me to guess, I think the share taken by US films will rise as some of our most exciting product is released. But I don't think the Chinese government has much to worry about in terms of US films dominating that market in the future.
You know, my hope is that the Chinese government listens to Lindsay, because right now, I mean, for those who follow it, you know that not every American film can get into China. In fact, very few do. Lindsay, you have to help me with the numbers. But let's say it's 40 or let's say 45 films that they officially.
34.
How many?
34 quota.
And that's the world. It's not just the US. I mean, that includes European films and others.
Yes.
Oh, wow.
So when you think about that box office, and you see how many films are now released in the US, streaming wise or in the movie theaters, it's well past 34, right? And so if you think about, well, it's actually pretty amazing then if of the 34 films, however many were American, but that's percentage, took 15% of the box office in China. There's actually a Chinese film I wanted to see. I think it's called Hi Mom. It came out over the years. I mean, it's huge. I don't know, 800 million. It's now like not just one of the largest selling films ever. It's, I think, the largest also by a solo women director. Another great, you know, accomplishment. But to be honest, it's hard to see those films in the U.S., right? And so your question was fascinating, really from more of a business, you know, Asian Development Bank, IMF, International Monetary Fund perspective. Until this year or so, if you look at, let's say, the last decade, China, because, you know, it's a lower base, but look at this amazing wealth they're creating. China, in many ways, has driven global growth. The IMF just came out with what they call their World Economic Outlook. And this may well be the first year that the US actually will drive, more than ever a percentage of growth than in the past, as both economies recover. China and the US will drive this global recovery for good and for bad. China will have a higher growth rate, but because the economy is smaller, not purchasing power parity, but smaller, the US actually, percentage-wise, will help drive global growth. So that goes very different than your question related specific to the entertainment industry. Lindsay is absolutely right on for all of you that have, if not just been to China, but just been to Asia. The theaters are amazing, all right? You're booking your seats. I can book a couch. I can have a champagne service. I mean, they're amazing.
Yes.
And actually,
order ice cream.
People don't also realize actually in the US, a lot of things, maybe IMAX too, if I recall, are actually owned by the Chinese. The Chinese are owners of our theaters in terms of where you watch it, but they haven't necessarily upgraded it to what you see overseas. I remember when New York experimented with booking your seat. I love to book my seat in a theater, right? Because then you just show up at the last minute. It didn't really fly in New York. Hopefully it'll change. But for me, the best theaters in the world are not in the US. They're in Asia. I can't speak to Europe and elsewhere. But for me, when I think of movies, it's still America. But my hope is that will change. And so, when I think about movies, I want to see smaller films or bigger films. They typically aren't yet those from China because we still have the reality of language. I remember last year when the Korean film Parasite won, the director, Director Bong, was America. You can read those, or you're not footnotes. You can read the subtitles. But I think America has an aversion to reading subtitles. And if you've ever seen a movie that's dubbed, it's just not quite the same thing. And so that is one hindrance I feel for Chinese product in the U.S. But it's not necessarily a hindrance in the rest of the world. In Asia, I'm so used to seeing films that are from Korea or Japan. You just read the subtitles. It's part of it. And so my hope is that it will evolve, that China will also be confident in its content and allow more films in. The US perspective, which isn't to say it's the right perspective always, but the US perspective is often, well, let's all battle it out on a level playing field. So let's let American content, French content, Japanese content, Chinese content battle it out, and let the Chinese consumer decide what they want to see. Because I'd rather have them watch an American film in one of China's amazing movie theaters than have them try and figure out how to download it, illegally through a VPN, or in the old days, it's like, well, that guy on the corner, he sells shoes, but if you tell them there's a whole thing of DVDs in the back room, right? Those days should be over if China is more confident in its ability to compete with American films. It just won't be this year for sure, but hopefully that is the future, and both the US and China will benefit from seeing each other's content.
That's a very good point. And just wanted to kind of talk about that one point of what do you think the place of Chinese films are in the US? I know you mentioned the other day about Crouching Tiger was the last one that really took the US by surprise. We really enjoyed it. But do you kind of see that happening in the future, or do you kind of see it being a cultural issue where you look at the top? I think, was it Wandering Earth was like the top Chinese film. You look at our top film and it's Avatar. Now it was Avengers, but either way, both times they had different. You look at they show our culture in a way, and so they're different cultures for the top grossing films. Do you think it'll usually be a cultural battle in a way, or not cultural battle, but a cultural indifference, and why it'll be hard for one to kind of really break the market with the other?
Look, US films have historically done very well at the Chinese box office. And when I historically, maybe too grand a term, since we started exporting a lot of them. This is all within the last 15 years or so. But before that, 15 years ago, the major studios basically wrote a zero in for their expectations for China. China was just a territory films didn't go, and then it suddenly became a very big box office. And we know that studios were changing scripts a little bit and doing things cast-wise and so forth, not only to please the censors to get into China, but to please Chinese audiences. But our films have done very well, and Chinese audiences have appreciated U.S. films. Now, they may be more the kind of tentpole spectaculars where what's really being appreciated is less the culture than the filmmaking technology and the storytelling. Curtis alluded to one of the things that's been an issue for Chinese films coming to the U.S., and that is alone really among the world's major territories, American audiences just, for the most part, don't like going to the theater and seeing subtitled films. Dubbed films are always hard, but in most territories, they're willing to do subtitles. We see subtitled films now on Netflix and on Amazon, and as a result of streaming, we are seeing more content come in from all over the world, China included. The question is, does that work at the theatrical box office, assuming the theaters are coming back in the way they have in China, and we have some hope that they'll come back in the United States. So that's one issue that's going to be hard to get around. There's also no doubt that the kinds of films audiences are used to here are different. There's just the themes are different. The storytelling is different. And sometimes it's hard for US audiences that have such a heavy diet of what we are used to and what we do like to accept something that's very new. So we'll see. And the thing is, it is recognizable to people on both sides of the Pacific. A few years ago, there was a picture called The Great Wall, which had a famous American actor who somehow happened to be in China during this battle over the Great Wall. It was directed by China's greatest living director, Zhang Yimou. Mm-hmm. And it was a co-production, which means it takes a larger share of the box office in China because it's an official co-production. And people thought, this is perfect. It didn't do that well in the United States because it was hard to figure why that American actor just showed up in China at that moment. They didn't do well in China either. Now, I was in Shanghai and speaking with a young woman who was studying film at a university in Shanghai. And I said to her, she wanted to be a director. And I said, why do you think it didn't do well in China? She said, it's not a Chinese film. Zhang Yimou directed it, yes. A lot of Chinese actors, yes. But the script was written by Americans. And she said, it just doesn't feel like a Chinese film. Chinese films don't have that flow, don't have that pacing, don't feel like that. It's clear that it's an American film. It's going to take a little while for the cultures to be accepting enough or interested enough to have films from China coming over here.
Which is
for Joey, you had mentioned Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, which actually is not a Chinese film. It's by Ang Lee. It's a Taiwanese, I don't know who actually produced it. Sure. But I really cannot think of a Chinese film that has done blockbuster business in the United States. When you live in LA or New York in the old days, I go to see every Zhang Yimou film or every Gong Li would be in it. You go see it. But then you look at the numbers, wow, that film made $3 million in the US. It was a big hit. And so I think, again, going back to that point, it was a fascinating point from Lindsay about just the storylines. I mean, for me, to be honest, an American production company could make an amazing film for China. You just hire the right people. You hire Chinese writers, you hire Chinese stars. But the reality is that film might not do any business in the US. And so as you're thinking through, what are you trying to accomplish in many ways that until now, at least, right, and maybe for the foreseeable future, the American formula of a great film will still do well, I think, for the most part in China, while a great Chinese film might not do as well in the United States if it were to get distribution, if it were to be subtitled, all those ifs. And I think both from, mentioned, it was Matt Damon, but whoever these stars are when they're doing a film in China or a Chinese star doing a film here, I don't know, for me, the track record has been that don't think that person will necessarily bring $100 million worth of business because you have the most famous American actor in this Chinese film or the most famous Chinese actor in this US film. I think it needs to go beyond that. It's interesting also, one more point for this panel, it's like Hollywood, but it's also about animation. And my hope, I think, is that where China might have a breakthrough here. Americans are used to seeing some amazing animation from Japan. Spirited Away, I think that even won the best animated feature film in 1 year. Because then you don't have all those problems of subtitling. It's subtitled, but you're less focused on, wow, that mouth really doesn't match that cartoon character, right? And so as I think about where China could well break through, would be some of a great animated story there. So I think there's opportunity for both China and the US, and of course the US in China to the degree they're allowed to do more there, that will be forthcoming. So even in these times of tense, geopolitical relationships, I'm always like Mr. Optimist. I always remain hopeful that these two great economies, these two great countries can continue to move forward despite, and I would say despite some legitimate grievances on both sides about what each country does or doesn't do.
Mm-hmm.
So I think for all of the students listening to this, I would say that there are opportunities, but just like for my many American friends who want to be in Hollywood, it's not necessarily you can do it just because you're Chinese, right? So if you think about it, think about also the competition and what are the skill sets that you'll also bring. So I have a great friend, a very senior executive at Disney, American, who wanted to get his Harvard MBA and was in a different career, right? But he decided, I want to be in that world of Hollywood. And then he took a lower paying job in the finance department, and he's a whiz, right? And he's now he moved his way up. But it's willing to go in at a certain level and prove yourself, whether it's a Chinese company or a US company, and move your way up, but also understand what drives the business, right? So if you're going into Hollywood, I'd say recognize it's a huge industry. That could be the marketing side, the talent side. It's a huge industry, but be sensitive to all those kind of, known unknowns that will come forth, particularly given US-China political relations.
Yeah, and right now, of course, one of the things that is holding back the China-Hollywood relationship is the what can I say, the poor relationship between the United States and China at the highest levels of government. Chinese people are very welcoming to me as an American when I'm in China. And I hope that we Americans are equally welcoming to Chinese people and people, frankly, from all over the world when they're here. So, the problem is not so much at the popular level, it's at the governmental level. We know the relationship is not good right now. And that does hold things back. It makes people a little more reluctant, to make investments. From here, the reluctance is, what's the Chinese market going to look like for us? From the Chinese perspective, it's a little different. It's because there's a political overlay. It's, if I do this deal, are folks in Beijing going to be upset with me? Am I going to be a little bit disfavored for doing this right now? Will it seem unpatriotic? And that's an additional element that folks in Hollywood don't really have. For us, it's a business proposition. Will it work or won't it? Hollywood clearly doesn't care a whole lot about what the administration in Washington, certainly what the Trump administration thought, and even so much what the Biden administration thinks. But in China, people do have to be at least aware of that as they make decisions, and that's slowed things down a little bit. Hopefully, the pendulum will swing back over the next couple of years, and there'll be a freer flow of business.
I know at one point you guys mentioned about it kind of being a cultural. It sounded like a little bit you guys were kind of hinting towards it might be a cultural difference between sorry, I'm trying to form my words, pretty much a cultural difference when it comes to the US looking at Chinese films because we're not very used to really seeing those subtitles. We're kind of used to seeing it on stuff like anime, but we're really not used to seeing that in a film with actual people. Now I know like Chinese culture is something that we Americans really don't quite understand, and that's really the point of GCC is to kind of highlight that and to help people to really form that connection between others. Would you say that the Chinese actors and the actresses they have a lot of responsibility when it comes to presenting Chinese culture to the U.S. audience, whether that be them be American born, actually be of Chinese ethnicity, like from China, a Chinese actor, like do you think they bear that responsibility?
Yeah, I'll speak to this one and then Lindsay jump in. But I want to build off something that Lindsay just said, which is, there's the government tensions, which get better and get worse. I mean, that's the reality, not just Trump, Biden, but if you look back at ever since China began to open, you've seen it go up and go down, right? And then unlike the US, China will, take action against business, thinking that business will then influence government. It was only until I think Trump really played the China game on China, trying to take actions against Chinese businesses, TikTok and others, right? And people are like, oh, that's crazy. But in some ways, China does that. So that's the government one. But it was an interesting comment that Lindsay made and that you just echoed in your question about that people to people level, including those like me and maybe people like watching with an Asian face. I won't even say Chinese face because sometimes you just lump together. And in this time of a growing, or at least reportedly growing, but I think growing anti-Asian hate in the U.S. They don't know if you're from China or Japan or you lived here for many generations or you just immigrated yesterday. No one knows, right? And you still have this. Because Hollywood really creates such an impression on impressionable younger people, particularly, but impression on how they think of a country, of a people. I would argue that Hollywood has done a bad job, right? Hollywood has done a great job making money, right? Yes. I don't want to disclose all my what stocks I own, but they've done a great job. But at the same time, you can't separate from what the business side of what Hollywood has done from the reality of today of why do people have stereotypes of Asian American women. I mean, look at just the horrid things that happened in Atlanta. And only because of Atlanta have people, mainstream media, begun to talk more about the stereotyping of Asian women on film, right? Blockbuster films, Full Metal Jacket, Apocalypse Now, movies that did very well. But then we look at today, we're like, I don't know if we make it that today. The other famous, most famous, I would say, for like old people like me, example, would be Breakfast at Tiffany's. What a classic, beautiful film. Audrey Hepburn is amazing. But then you look at what's Mickey Rooney doing in there, where he's like made up, the stereotypes of an age. I think he's something like Mr. Miyake. I can't remember what his name was upstairs, the Japanese photographer. But Hollywood didn't care. I mean, that's sold in America. And so I would hope that Hollywood looks at what they are doing in telling stories, right? And we've seen progress. Marvel's going to have an Asian, superhero. We've seen progress because hopefully they're saying, well, there'll be good business results too. But then you also still see these references and these side things. So Hollywood has a responsibility, and it is not just the role of an actor speaking up because, well, then we'll hire someone else. Why have these actors, Asian actors, been in now what we see are stereotype roles? Because they wouldn't get any other work, right? So let's also be realistic about that and not just focus on the role of an Asian American actor to speak up. I was on a Clubhouse session with Daniel Dae Kim, Olivia Munn. Many of these great actors are speaking up on these issues, but it shouldn't just be Asians who have to speak up on this. And the other side, I would say we haven't really gotten there because we really don't watch Chinese films. But when you do watch Chinese films, I can tell you the stereotypes of Americans aren't necessarily negative, but they aren't so wonderful either. It's the arrogant white guy, right? Typically, right? You don't see Chinese films casting Americans as people that look like me. right? Oh, then they won't think you're an American in that film. And China in particular controls the content of films directly or indirectly, more so than the United States. And that's not just what goes in, but what people see. And so I always chuckle a little bit when, you know, there's some tension between Japan and China or Korea that sparks, and all of a sudden the big film that's being released is an anti-Japanese war film that just happens to be released in China during the time of rising tensions between China and Japan. So it's a little bit of a different world there, but it speaks to that same issue that my hope is that the film industry, which is much freer in America than, let's say, in China, can also think through what are they doing in encouraging negative stereotypes and intentions or intentions unintentionally. You know, if the government wants you intentionally to do it, that's a whole different issue. But I would speak more to the unintentional messages of Chinese films, and including Chinese films that look at minorities in America. If you've seen how Africans and Black Americans are portrayed in Chinese films, it isn't always the best light, right? And so I'd say each side, hopefully, will take this, you know, anti-Asian hate and think through, well, what have we done or what can we do to address these issues of stereotyping of people?
There was a lot there. I'm just going to respond to a couple of things. One is Hollywood hopefully will be a lot more thoughtful in the future about casting, about storylines and stereotypes. There is an awful lot of soft power in the media, and I think a lot of people in Hollywood don't even think about it. They're just out there to get their script made, or they're just out there to get to have the film be successful, and an increasing mindfulness about how Asians and Asian Americans are portrayed and what messages are being sent. I think that's seeping in Hollywood. It's long overdue. Fortunately, it's dovetailing with a business perspective that's useful. One of the reasons why you didn't see as many Black or Latino or Asian faces in a lot of Hollywood product over the years was a false sense, but a sense in Hollywood that people won't go to see those movies. That was the old saw in Hollywood. And then, you know, within a year, Black Panther, Coco, Crazy Rich Asians all blew the doors off the box office and essentially blew up that old quote unquote wisdom, which wasn't wise at all. And I think Hollywood appreciates from a business standpoint that it probably never made sense and doesn't make sense in the diverse culture we have in America and around the world. So I think the trend line, at least, is moving in the right direction. We got a long way to go. The trend line is moving. But it does highlight a difference of the two countries. Sure. There is no organizing principle in American films. It's just the government doesn't tell anybody what to make. It's just what a bunch of studios and now a bunch of streamers individually elect to make. And nobody says yes or no, and they make largely commercially driven decisions. In China, you have both state-owned entities and privately owned entities that are making film and television content. But the government does have a role. And the lack of predictability can be a bit daunting. Now, you know, those who are responsible for censorship, which got moved from the Chinese government to the propaganda department of the Communist Party of China a few years ago, would probably say not a terrible thing. We'd like people to do self-censorship. I mean, that's something that the Chinese government wants to see in its film community. But it also introduces a good deal of uncertainty, and no better example of it than The 800. For those of you who don't know, The 800 is a film made by Huayi Brothers. It beautifully brings to life an incident from the early stages of World War II, when Imperial Japan had invaded China and was marching down to take over Shanghai, and a small contingent, whatever the number was, a small contingent of Chinese troops held off the Japanese attack long enough for the main part of the Chinese army to escape to the west and continue the war. Heroic, one might say, well, definitely heroic, one might say very patriotic, and Huai brothers thought this would be perfect. And in 2019, it was thought so highly of, including apparently by the censors. It was the opening night gala film scheduled for the Shanghai Film Festival. And when I arrived in Shanghai the night before, people were WeChatting me and saying, do you have tickets to the 800? I didn't. I was just going to speak at a conference. I said, no. By the time I got to my hotel, the news was out. The government had pulled it. It was no longer the opening night film. In fact, it couldn't even open in the cinemas in China. Why? Because someone else in the government had watched it and said, wait a second. Those Chinese soldiers, those aren't communist Chinese soldiers. Those are the nationalist Chinese soldiers who were in charge of China at that time. And the flag they're waving, spoiler alert, if you haven't seen it, the flag they're waving from the top of the warehouse after they succeed in holding off the Japanese attack, that's not the Communist Party's flag, that's the nationalist flag. And they yanked it right out of the film festival and prohibited from opening in the theaters. I mean, it put a real strain on Huai brothers. The happier ending is they allowed it to be released last year. Some changes were made, some blurring was done, and they allowed it to be released last year, and it was the biggest film of the year in China and the world. So it can succeed, and it can, the film industry can, achieve that cultural distinction, but there is a lot of uncertainty when your film can pass censorship and be the leading film of the film festival scheduled, and then get yanked out of the theater the night before.
For me, it's an amazing story, and one that also, for younger people, working their way up in the business, to think through, at what point in your career do you say, well, that's what I got to do to move ahead, or, that goes against, whatever your personal ethics and beliefs are. I was struck by that story. I didn't know it was about like the flag, or I'm sure there are other things that needed to be changed. But I don't know if you all remember, or last year, one of the stories about one of the films that was going to be released is the new Top Gun. And just in history, one of the great parts, and actually, if you remember, it was the nationalists, but it was the U.S. and China working together. How great that was. Let's hopefully that happens again one day. But one of the story things, which will be a great film again one day, were the Flying Tigers, this group of people under General Chennault that flew, over the Himalayas to supply the resistance in China. But yeah, it was the nationalist flag, and apparently it was on the leather jacket that Tom Cruise or some character is wearing in Top Gun. And of course, I'm sure they're thinking it's going to be a blockbuster film in China. So that jacket's got to change. So even if it's no longer actually correct, but this is fiction, it gets to that, well, do we change the history to make sure that it can at least have a chance to be a huge film in China? I mean, these are questions that people think through. These are questions I think actors think through about what should they say if they want to speak up on something because they believe, this is a cause the world needs to pay attention to. And that's actually, frankly, one reason for, I think, the first time in decades that the Oscar ceremony won't even be shown live in Hong Kong, free Hong Kong, because what if some actor speaks up, or there's a short documentary nominated, and what if that wins, and then, wow, what are they going to say up on stage? They want to be able to edit out the Oscars that you're going to see in Hong Kong. China is another thing, but the special administrative region of Hong Kong. So I mean, these are all the things, the nuances that people have to understand and think through. Where will we stand? Where would I stand? Particularly if I'm kind of like a peon in this business. I'm not the CEO who can make some bigger decisions. I'm still trying to work my way up the ranks. And so as we think about, as we try and get these two countries to work together, entertainment is a particularly challenging one, given that unpredictability, the nuance, and things continue to change. Where do you think, I just want to make some great content that will entertain the world, not just the US or China. So how do we do that?
One of the things, and in this respect, the the entertainment industry is a microcosm. I mean, in some respects, it's not, right? In some respects, the entertainment industry is somewhat unique, anomalous, not like a lot of other things. But in one respect, at least, it does seem a bit of a microcosm. And that is the American system and the Chinese system in so many areas, including entertainment, are different.
Yeah.
And one of the things that is at stake in the coming years is how we, and by we I mean the United States, China, and the world, how we figure out how these two systems can cooperate where they can, compete where they must, but do it in a way that doesn't hinder the progress of the world in important areas. And it's a little challenge. I mean, you know, for me, I've spent my life in the industry, so it seems like a big deal. Let's face it, what we're talking about is not the biggest thing in the world when we're talking, you know, in the geopolitical competition or cooperation between the United States and China. There's a lot bigger stuff going on than whether a film is going to get in, or you know, or whether an American film is going to get on iQIYI or a Chinese film will succeed in the U.S. But there is a bit of a microcosm, and we have to see if the two systems can, if not work together where they can, and at least accommodate enough so that we don't have a kind of jarring collision.
Sorry, he did end up making his appearance.
And there you go.
Everyone, this is the GCC mascot, Teddy. He, of course, had to make his little appearance.
Well, that's by the way, to Curtis's point earlier about animation, dogs, the two cultures can agree on.
Yeah.
Animation, the two cultures can agree on. And as we saw in the last couple of years, giant prehistoric fish.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, was it Megalodon? What was that film?
Successful on both sides of the can be successful on both sides of the Pacific, and you know, so there are certain touch points where people in both cultures appreciate things the same way. But this is one of the challenges that filmmakers and business executives in the entertainment industry alike are going to have to work on, and it's going to take patience, it's going to take creativity, some thoughtfulness, and a lot more dialogue. And I hope face-to-face dialogue once COVID ends, you know, than the wonders of Zoom can bring us.
Hopefully, yeah. And on that point, we'll go ahead and wrap this up. Then if anybody has any questions for you two, you guys can go ahead and really unmute yourselves, or you can ask it in the Q&A box.
Hey, Joey, as people ask questions, you know, one thing I would want to flag, beyond Hollywood and animation, with this year of where streaming has really boomed, I would just want to flag to people to think also about the world of documentary film, right?
Oh, yeah.
And I think documentaries can also drive greater understanding between these two countries, China and the US. Because, you know, in the past, you know, documentaries, I would think hardly had ever made it into a big theater unless it's like Michael Moore or something, but there's so many amazing documentary films. And two I will flag for people to consider. One is a Chinese American film called Finding Ying Ying, which I think is gonna go up actually on Paramount Plus for streaming, I just saw. The story about a mainland Chinese student that came to the US to, you know, if you have people at University of Illinois watching, but, you know, came to actually a school in Illinois and sadly was murdered, right? And that documentary, amazing film, Finding just won best documentary, foreign documentary in China. You know, maybe it's because they thought America looked good, you know, there's probably other politics involved, but it is an amazing film. And then the flip side is a film called My Time Machine, or Our Time Machine, which is about a Shanghainese puppeteer who creates a puppet show for his father who has Alzheimer's or dementia. So the show, you know, recreates their past, and just a beautiful film that is mainly subtitled, but now is also being used by the Alzheimer, you know, Association or Foundation of the U.S. because it speaks to some universal themes. Father, son, people getting older. So I'd say also look to documentaries. I don't say as a career, right? It's tough to make money, but sometimes you do amazing things through documentaries. And I think, as Lindsay noted, now I'm like watching films. I think, I don't know, they probably filmed that film on an iPhone and edited it on their big computer, and it looks amazing. So think of documentaries also as a chance to also show your skills as you think about how do I break into this industry.
Yeah, and the documentary business in the U.S. Has really gotten much bigger and much better as a result of the streamers. Netflix, Amazon, others are buying documentaries that unfortunately would never have seen the light of day apart from a few film festivals before. And that's now actually a business. People making documentaries, selling documentaries. Netflix makes their own, commissioning documentaries. So that is now a part of our business. And I think it's a welcome thing. And I hope it will succeed on both sides of the Pacific.
I think that's a very great point. I want to go ahead and wrap it up, and then we can go back and discussing this, because I know we can definitely talk about this for a long time. I learned a lot from you all. Just want to let everyone know, like, this is a series of panels. Oh my gosh. And of course, this doesn't want to come up. All right, perfect. I can share my screen and show you all. The next few panels will be based on new technologies reshaping our world, which would be 5G, AI, and big data. Everyone knows big data processing and all that. That's very integral, and understanding different things in the bio world, engineering all over the place. So these are very hot topics. So be sure to come in on the 15th and the 16th to tune into those panels to hear what those panelists have to say about those topics. But other than that, as of now, the event is officially over. We can, if you all want to still stay around, talk, by all means. Mr. Chen, Mr. Connor, for sure, I definitely want to continue this conversation. You don't feel, if you guys have to go, for sure, you guys can go ahead and go. But I didn't want to cut you guys off. Just want to go ahead and wrap up the event and allow everyone to do what they need to do.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to have been here. I'm going to have to jump off, but it's a fascinating field to work in, and I hope that some of the people listening tonight will choose to go into it. There's no magic carpet here, but it is a very unique ride, and one that can have a benefit not only economically but culturally as well. I think it's a great bridge between the cultures of the U.S. and China, and hopefully that bridge will strengthen in the years to come.
Yeah, so I'd like to really thank you all, and thank you everyone for showing up to this event, because it's honestly, I really learned a lot. I can't really stress that enough. I mean, I'm an engineer, so learning about the entertainment industries, I see it, but I don't really know about all the nuances. I know about the politics of China, US, I know about that, but I never really get to hear about it from, really hear its impact on the media industry as much.
Yeah, let me close by just adding one thing, which is, at the Milken Institute, one of the programs that, under this big Milken umbrella we do, we have a group of students, I know one of them might be one of you, called Milken Scholars, where, the education is helped pay for it. And one of them is an amazing poet that many of you probably all saw this year, named Amanda Gorman, who spoke at President Biden's inaugural. And Amanda Gorman, in that beautiful poem, she talked about, she's asked about America, but in her view, she said, America, is not broken. Certainly we're having very challenging times. It's changing, it's evolving. And I would just echo that when I think about China-US relations, whether it's Hollywood or, in my world, we're dealing with fintech and manufacturing products. I would say it's not broken, this most important relationship, but it is changing, it is evolving, and it isn't just the US's responsibility to change, you know, it's, I think, both sides' responsibility to change. And I think the world of film and television, this content creation, is really, for me, one of the more fascinating worlds, because it might not be as important as, you know, exchanging pharmaceuticals and all the things that we're focused on these days. But it is a very real example of an industry where the US, for the most part, has been a key leader. You know, China also wants to match, and they've matched already if you just look at box office. But as we think now about soft power and other things, I think each country, each company, each industry needs to be thinking about reinventing, you know, how do they do things a little bit differently? Because this pandemic will end at some point. But there'll be some good things that will carry over in terms of people more used to streaming. You know, hopefully that they watched a bunch of things also with some subtitles, and they'll be like, well, maybe I will watch that film now with subtitles. It was okay, right? So, you know, maybe there'll be some of these incremental changes. So it can be so doom and gloom when you look online, whether it's like sadly viral videos of anti-Asian hate or headline stories about US-China tensions. It can be a little bit, you know, anxiety producing. But there are a lot of good stories in that big mix also of US-China cooperation, which I think we all want to spotlight also and encourage. And I would say, you know, your generation, Joey, I mean, you're in a way the future. And it's great because I think your Chinese is better than my Chinese.
Oh, your Chinese is amazing.
How do we then move these relationships forward? You know, US-China, US-Japan, Japan-China, all of these relationships. And I hope that Hollywood and the Chinese film industry can be part of shaping those stories, telling those stories for the better of everyone. So thank you. I'm going to have to jump off too, but thank you so much.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
We should have informal chats all the time. I really feel like I can learn so much.
All right.
Take care.
Signing off.
Yeah.